So welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to have you all here with the StandWithUs Netherlands, StandWithUs Israel with Charlotte, and also with Lucas Pizzichino from Atikva. And we also here have connected, by the way, also Patricio from Latin America. And I'm David Fiorentini. I'm the Vice President of UJEI, the Italian Union of Jewish Students and Young Professionals. And today, actually, we're hosting our first webinar in English and in our page together with StandWithUs. And we have here our special guest, Charlotte, who's going to talk to us about the evolving situation in the Middle East, of how the relationship with Israel are changing all throughout the world, not only in the Arab world with the Abraham Accords, but also throughout many other nations. As well, she will give us also a brief overview of what is StandWithUs, what do they do. And but first, I would like to give the word to Elad Ziegler from StandWithUs Netherlands, who here is our partner in this live stream. And yeah, Elad, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you so much, David. This is so exciting. Thank you so much for inviting us and for setting this up. So good evening, everyone. I'm Elad Ziegler. I'm the director of StandWithUs Holland. And I will speak to you a little bit, a couple of minutes about StandWithUs and StandWithUs Holland, because I don't want to rob you of the pleasure to listen to Charlotte for a very long time. So StandWithUs started in 2001. We are an international organization that does Israel education and fighting anti-Semitism in the whole world. And in 2001, they started because at the time there was the first intifada, the second intifada, sorry, and the media were just misrepresenting everything about Israel. And they just had enough. So they set up this amazing organization, which Charlotte will talk more about, to counter this misinformation, counter the hate, and work towards peace. 4 years ago, I got introduced to this amazing organization in 2016. And in 2016, for those that you don't remember, the knife intifada was going on. So people were just being stabbed in Israel. And in Holland, in the papers and in other places, public opinions, people were saying that Israel was planting these knives, that we would kill Palestinians and then planting knives next to them. So I was sitting at the time in Israel and thinking what I could do about it. And then I got into contact with this amazing organization, and they helped me to set up StandWithUs in the Netherlands. This was 4 years ago. And now 4 years later, we've grown up into a big and mature organization, which is doing a lot of exciting things. And then we got introduced to some amazing Italian people who wanted to bring StandWithUs also to Italy. So that's why we're doing this live. We're introducing the Italians to StandWithUs and StandWithUs to Italy. So we're making StandWithUs strong in Europe. Right now, StandWithUs is all over America, in Israel, in South America, South Africa, even in Asia. And we're trying to beef up the game of StandWithUs also in Europe, because as you all know, Europe at the moment, anti-Semitism in Europe, it's not looking that good. And we're positive that StandWithUs can make a change in this, that we can work towards peace, because in the end, peace is all about education. If you educate people, we can get peace closer. So that's why I'm so excited to do this, so excited to be here. So I think I've talked enough. So if you want to follow us, then you can go to StandWithUs Holland, StandWithUs Nederland, it's called, because it's in Dutch. You can like us, you can like our Instagram. There's also StandWithUs Italy, like that page as well. You can go to the website standwithus.com to sign up for the newsletter. And if you're an Italian and you're listening and you're thinking, I want to be part of this amazing organization, just send a message either to UJ or to the StandWithUs Italian page directly, and they'll lead you to the right way. So David, giving it back to you.
David, oh, you're muted.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for this brief introduction. This was amazing. Really, also the meeting of today, as Elad said, is also propedeutic to find new people who are interested in Italy to join the world of StandWithUs, which is an amazing reality that, as we said, is known worldwide. And now I think we are ready to talk finally with Charlotte, and I'll briefly say that today we want to talk about two main topics. So as we said, this new diplomatic process that is beginning again to move, like it was at least 24 years that Israel didn't sign a peace agreement. So finally, we are moving towards peace. It's really amazing to see that happening. And then later, if also Charlotte wants to talk about, again, about what Stand With Us does exactly, how they work in Israel, especially now. I understood that you are in the States, so also can tell us how the reality is over there, that I imagine is much more widespread, and they are doing many more activities than we do here in Europe. And yes, so thank you very much to be with us, Charlotte. It's a great honor, and go. Yeah.
All right, I'll take it away. Thank you so much, David, and thank you obviously to everyone who was part of organizing this. We at Stand With Us are obviously very excited to expand our reach and expand the education of Israel throughout Europe, and obviously into Italy and the Netherlands and anywhere else that we can, get to, so that people can understand what's actually going on there better. Just really quickly, Stand With Us. More importantly, I think the word that we use consistently to explain ourselves is education. We're an education organization. We want people to truly understand what's actually going on. That's really our goal. And it's not a matter of educating from one side or the other, from the right or the left. It's really just trying to get a full picture so that people can decide for themselves how they feel about Israel, what their thoughts are on Israel. Now, like David mentioned, I'll talk more about Stand With Us a little bit towards the end. I want to kind of dive into the current situation that's going on here. Or that's going on, I should say, around the world when it comes to Israel. So yes, you are absolutely right. We had a big breakthrough. About a month and a half ago, where it hit the news that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, well, starting with the United Arab Emirates, we're going to start to normalize relations with Israel. Bahrain jumped on that train, and in the same day, actually the first time ever in history, in the same day, two countries decided to sign normalization agreements with Israel and peace agreements with Israel. Now, it's interesting that we're calling them peace agreements, so I want to start with that very quickly. And again, we'll kind of expand as to how this then bled into other places. But they're called peace agreements, even though we've never really been in direct war with either the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain. But why we're describing them as peace agreements is because it goes beyond just normalizing relations in terms of the governments sharing, information, in terms of having security coordination, and obviously economic benefits that we're seeing as well come out of these deals. But what they're also trying to do is create a warm peace between these two populations. And that is something that's different from what we had with Egypt and Jordan. Egypt and Jordan, it was really, to a certain extent, there was a little bit of a begrudging way in which they went about making peace with Israel. It wasn't that everyone was on board. It was the circumstances. When it came to Egypt, they wanted, the Sinai back. And Anwar Sadat really just wanted to end the conflict to a certain extent. But there was no effort made to, implant in Egyptian people the idea that Israel is now our friend rather than our enemy. And so until today, people in Egypt are still taught negative things about Israel and about Jews. And it's the same in Jordan. Jordan being, that you didn't really need to teach that much, but Jordan being a majority Palestinian population, you don't see those warm relations. You don't see travel happening that much between these countries. And so with the UAE and Bahrain, what they're really trying to do is create that warm peace between people. So it's not just the governments, it's let's make sure that there's tourism, and let's make sure that there are direct flights, and let's make sure that more and more Israelis and Arabs from these countries can meet and interact, so that eventually it's going to be a real peace. And most importantly, the peace won't be reliant on the regimes. Right? We understand that if in Egypt and Jordan, the regime turned, right? Like, for example, the fear of what happened when Mohamed Morsi was elected back when Mubarak was toppled during the beginning of the Arab Spring, the real fear was what's going to happen with this relationship, because Mohamed Morsi was Muslim Brotherhood, not exactly pro-Israel. And so there was this instability for a hot second. So what they really want to do is make sure that this isn't just reliant on the regimes, that this will be an ongoing and what we would call a lasting peace between these countries. Now, before I'll talk about that a little bit more. I just want to quickly talk about the other headlines because I think there's a lot more to talk about, and it will definitely kind of bleed into what's going on with the Palestinians and kind of how this all has impacted that conflict. So first of all, I just want to kind of pull back and acknowledge that the UAE and Bahrain, this happened. And then all of a sudden we saw a few other countries kind of jump in and also talk about kind of normalizing relations or recognizing Israel. So the first one was obviously, we saw that Serbia and Kosovo, they were talking in the United States, and the US really pushed for there to be an additional piece within these agreements that were being signed, and that was Israel. Now, what was interesting is you have Kosovo, which actually, Kosovo, which recognized Israel. And you also have that Serbia recognized Israel already. Scratch that. But you have both of them saying, you know what, we'll normalize relations, we'll start to talk to Israel more. And then there was this push of, okay, and we may move our embassies to Jerusalem. This is a huge jump from having almost no interaction, and Israel being one of the countries who didn't recognize Kosovo's independence when they declared independence from Serbia in 2008. And there's really a lot of complexity that goes into the conversation about the Balkans and the relationship between these countries and where does Israel fit in. But one of the things that we need to acknowledge is that a lot of people compare Kosovo to the Palestinians, and their declaring independence is similar to the Palestinians trying to declare independence from Israel. And so there was a real hesitation by Israel to recognize Kosovo as an independent country, in the fear that that could potentially give more credence to the Palestinian argument of wanting independence without negotiations, right? Unilateral independence, which from the Oslo Accords, which were signed back in the 90s between Israel and the Palestinians, it was determined that moving forward, any step couldn't be unilateral, that it needs to be bilateral. There needs to be a discussion before somebody takes any kind of step. So there was this fear that if you support this, then you're going to encourage and give credence to the Palestinians to go ahead and do this as well. Well, now we're seeing somewhat of a shift in that policy from the Israeli side of, okay, now we will have a relationship with Kosovo, but the recognition of Kosovo by Israel would ultimately be a blow to the Serbs. And so what we need to realize is, as much as both of them came out and said, Serbia said, we're going to move our embassy to Jerusalem, and Kosovo said, being, let's acknowledge, also the first Muslim country in Europe that would do this, said that they would recognize Israel and that they would move their embassy. As soon as this happened, very quickly, within about 24 hours, kind of both sides came out saying, but wait a second, if you do this with the other side, we're not going to be okay with it. And so it happened, and it was this moment of a headline, but there's a lot of politics that need to play out before either of these things are going to happen. And so as much as it was this big headline, we need to acknowledge that there's a lot of behind the scenes that are going to take place to actually make this a reality. Some would argue that this was really just the Trump administration trying to get these headlines so that, you know, and unfortunately I have to bring it back to the United States because the Trump administration were really the architects of this. You know, they're running for an election and they want these headlines. So it was a big headline. And it is obviously a good step in the right direction, but there's still a lot of complexity that we're going to, and a lot of interesting diplomatic kind of maneuvering that's going to need to take place for this to actually become something real and legitimate. So we'll see. But of course, anyone saying we want to talk, we want to have this relationship is a positive for Israel. So we'll see how that progresses. Now, when it comes to, at the same time, by the way, and I'll just mention this very briefly, another country also came out saying, you know what, we're going to open a diplomatic office in Israel. And that was the country of Malawi. I know that is random, but again, the whole point of this is talking about how it kind of, there's like what's the word I'm looking for? There's like an effect of one country's doing it, so now maybe we should do it too. And more we're seeing that people are realizing that if other countries are doing it, then we can also have relations with Israel, even though in the past, maybe it was seen as taboo or wrong. And that's changing, kind of looking and saying, well, if the UAE and Bahrain can do it, then we can do it as well. Okay, so that's a real big positive for Israel. Now, the other country, and we're going to very much shift in terms of where we are in the world, is Honduras. Now, Honduras hasn't been necessarily a very negative country towards Israel. They actually back last year in 2019, they did recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. They followed the United States, and the only other country, by the way, that has actually moved their embassy to Jerusalem is Guatemala. And so they followed that kind of, and they said, you know what? We, again, tried to pick up relations with them. There's been a lot of effort in Honduras to continue to develop the diplomatic relations with Israel. And so they've now announced that they are going to try to move their embassy to Jerusalem by the end of 2020. Now, again, they said that, and then they said COVID allowed. So like, if the pandemic allows this to happen, we'll try to move our embassy by the end of 2020. We'll see. I do just want to stress, before I jump back to the Abraham Accords, that I think we all need to kind of remember that over the last few years, really ever since the Americans moved their embassy to Jerusalem, a lot of countries have come out saying that they're going to do that, but nobody actually has yet. Only the Guatemalans, and actually the Guatemalans moved their embassy before the Americans did. Most people don't know that. The Guatemalans, and it shouldn't be surprising, Guatemala is a country that historically has been supportive of Israel. They were actually the second country to recognize Israel in 1948 after the Americans and before the Soviet Union. They snuck in at number 2, which is really interesting. And so they were the first ones to move their embassy. They just decided to hold off on a formal opening of their embassy until the Americans opened theirs, to give the Americans kind of that stage. But up until now, we've only seen Guatemala and the United States move their embassies. So as much as we've had these statements from a good amount of countries, Romania has come out and said it, now Honduras, now Serbia and Kosovo, but then again, both of them kind of said, well, if you recognize the other, then there's going to be an issue. And so we'll see, I think, is really the key. But regardless of those kind of measures of, okay, we've actually physically moved our embassy from one place to the other, I just think we need to acknowledge and see the positive ultimately. In the more countries who want to have those relationships, who want to talk to Israel, the better off Israel is going to be on the global stage. You know, if I can just throw in a little sidebar, anti-Semitism is a problem, as I'm sure we all know. Anti-Semitism is a problem in the world. But very oftentimes people tend to either say, no, it's not that big of an issue, or they say, well, there isn't really institutionalized anti-Semitism. I hear that a lot in the United States, right? Well, there is, like, you'll see like peer-to-peer, but you won't see it institutionalized. What we need to realize is that anti-Semitism is institutionalized in the global stage, right? In the United Nations, right? We have issues in the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice where there is bias against Israel. And so the more countries that come out and maybe have Israel's back in the international field, that's obviously better for Israel. So regardless of whether they move their embassy to Jerusalem or not, the key is that recognition and that wanting to have diplomatic relations, and the hope that then when and if Israel comes, well, not if, but when a vote comes to the table, when it comes to Israel and the United Nations, that Israel will have maybe a fairer chance in those spaces. So we'll see, but it really does feel like it's kind of, rolling, which is a good thing. And we're talking about opening up relations with countries that in the past we've never been able to open relations with. And you could even add to this list Uganda. Bibi Netanyahu made an official visit to Uganda, and obviously other countries in the Middle East, where after the Abraham Accords, you had this prospect of other countries that also historically, some of them who have historically had relations with Israel, but they've always been kind of behind closed doors, like Oman, or countries like Morocco, who never really had that much animosity towards Israel, who's now talking about potentially, deepening the relationship. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia kind of sits there as someone who's giving their approval of all of this, but has yet to do it themselves. And then you have Sudan. If I could just throw out, just yesterday, you had 3 leaders of 3 different political parties in Sudan come out very strongly saying we need to move forward with the normalization of relations with Israel. So there's a lot going on and a lot to look at. What I want to do now is dive deeper into the Abraham Accords and again, talk about how that also is affecting the Palestinians. So like I mentioned, the Abraham Accords was really about a warm peace, right? It's about creating peace between the people. And there's an extra piece here that I think is really important that we should talk about, which is that the UAE today, and has for a long time, acted as kind of a hub of business. And so what you have is a reality where you have people from around the Arab and Muslim world coming to the UAE to conduct business. And we're talking about, yes, people from the Sunni countries that are more moderate today that are kind of becoming more and more favorable towards Israel, but you also have people coming from the more malign countries like Iran or Syria, or Lebanon. I was going to say Lebanon, but Lebanon not really, because Lebanon, the people there, there's a diversity. Hezbollah is anti, but some of the people are not so anti. But the point that I'm trying to make is that with all of this happening, if now you introduce Israelis into that picture as well, that now Israelis are going to be going and doing this business in the UAE, you have more of an opportunity of, again, that people-to-people interaction that's going to take place. And if that happens with people from these more maligned countries, you end up seeing a potential ripple effect of them going back to their countries with a more positive image of Israel and Israelis. And that can start to change the reality from the ground up, right? StandWithUs is a very grassroots organization, and we believe in that grassroots interaction being probably one of the more powerful tools in terms of being able to normalize relations. And so that's an interesting piece that could really, again, have an ultimate ripple effect. Now, some examples of really showing that this is real. We want to make real relations, and we want to see these relations continue on in the future. So there's a few agreements that have already been signed. We've signed an agreement with the UAE. And when I say we, I'm talking Israel. I'm an Israeli as much as I'm an American, but I live in Israel today. And so whenever I say we, just know that I'm referring to Israelis. Israel has signed an agreement with the UAE already for medical research and development, specifically into finding a COVID vaccine or COVID treatment, but also that will expand into other things as well. So that's one area that we're going to move forward with more relations. We've got an Israeli soccer player for the first time ever was signed to an Arab team. The Dubai soccer team signed an Israeli soccer player. And I know that might sound insignificant for those of us who don't care about soccer or sports, but I'm talking to Europeans. And you guys do see the significance, I think, in sports and the ability of sports to really bridge gaps and push aside politics. And so that's, I think, a big moment. And we'll see how that also has a ripple effect. We have film and TV cooperation agreements that are being signed. And again, why does that matter? Well, pop culture plays a huge role. There was a big headline in the last 6 months that a Saudi TV show for the first time depicted Jews in a positive way. And it was a major headline for us because historically, in just regular pop culture, Jews or Israelis would be depicted in a very negative light. And so if we have more of this cooperation in film and TV and that development, what we can see is ultimately better portrayals of Jews and Israelis that could ultimately, again, have this ripple effect, changing that perception that for so long has been the predominant perception in the Middle East of Israel and of Israelis, or of Zionists, as they would probably say as well, throwing in that term. And I already talked about the other few, but we're talking about a lot more press access, so the press can kind of work their way to the different countries and expose more of the countries to those people. And again, direct flights being a key, and increased tourism. Now, when I talk about direct flights, this kind of bleeds me over into Saudi Arabia and into Bahrain. Bahrain jumped on board, and Bahrain jumping on board, yes, they have the ability to do that, but we have to acknowledge that Bahrain and Saudi Arabia are really tied to each other. And Saudi Arabia almost holds some kind of power over Bahrain. They kind of have veto power over their policies. And so if Saudi Arabia was not okay with them jumping on board with these accords, Saudi Arabia would have shut it down. They didn't, which means that they gave their support quietly, but they gave their support. And where they're not so quietly giving their support is allowing flights to fly over Saudi Arabian territory from Israel to the UAE and to Bahrain. So as much as the Saudis haven't, again, come out very vocal and positive about this, they are giving their support. The reason many people say why they're not coming out so vocally is because they still have a public that is aggressive towards Israel and that carries some animosity towards Israel. And so they need to slowly work more on the Saudi public before they can really openly embrace normalizing full relations with Israel. And in their circumstances, it would be making peace with Israel because Saudis have been involved historically in wars against Israel. So that's just an interesting piece as well. Now, what we're seeing because of all of this, right? Saudi Arabia giving their quiet approval, Bahrain, the UAE, what we're really seeing is a shift in what we would call the classic pan-Arab consensus. What was that consensus? That Israel has to make peace with the Palestinians first, and then we'll normalize relations, right? Where do we see this most? In the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative. Okay, look it up if you don't know about it. 2002, the Arab League proposed a peace initiative, really at the behest of Saudi Arabia, to call for normalizing relations with Israel. They demanded that Israel withdraw to the pre-1967 armistice lines. And then they would, and so ending our presence and allowing a Palestinian state to be formed, and then they would normalize relations with us. So you see, that was the classic idea of how we were going to solve these conflicts. Well, that's shifted. It's shifted. Now, the Palestinians today very much feel like they're being abandoned, right? They feel like, well, we were center stage, right? Our issue was being put center stage, and now it's not anymore. Is that actually true? I think that's how they're perceiving it, because they feel like the more people normalize relations with Israel, it almost is giving the Israeli government kind of approval to continue doing what they're doing to the Palestinians and to perpetuate this ongoing conflict. But really, many have come out saying just the opposite. It's not that you're not center stage anymore. It's just that we're changing the dynamic, that maybe instead of waiting for Israel to do what they're going to do with the Palestinians, maybe if we normalize relations with Israel and we have a better relationship with Israel and the Israeli government, then we actually have leverage and we can actually push for more Palestinian rights through a government that now we have relations with. And that's what we're hearing from the Emiratis and from Bahrain. We'll have more of an influence in Israel. And so we can then insist that our relationship is contingent on progress with the Palestinians. And so that's going to be a really interesting dynamic, because they're basically putting themselves in the position and saying, we could be an alternative mediator. Instead of relying on the West, on Western countries who don't really fully understand the Arab mindset and Arab dynamics, we could be the alternative mediator to be able to help, again, bring this conflict to an end for the Palestinians and get them the rights that they very much deserve. Now, at the same time, what they're also trying to do is really edge out the malign actors that have really played a core role in the Palestinian conflict. Those actors being predominantly, obviously, Iran, who has historically supported Hamas in the Gaza Strip, who supports Palestinian Islamic Jihad until today. And then, of course, you have Qatar, who today is paying the salaries of Hamas. You have Turkey, who has really turned the other direction in terms of really being a bolstering force for the Palestinians and specifically for Hamas, and also making really outlandish statements. I don't know if anyone heard this, but last week, Erdogan came out saying, you know, Jerusalem is our city. Okay, buddy, cool your tits kind of thing, like calm down, pull back. But the point is that these countries, what do they encourage? They encourage violence as a solution. They encourage Palestinian rejectionism, right? And I'll touch upon that in just one second, but they encourage the continued rejection of the existence of a Palestinian, of a Jewish state. Now, if we pull back a second and look at the conflict, and when I say the conflict, right now I'm talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict was so rooted in rejectionism. It was from 1937 onwards, the consensus was, we do not support a Jewish state existing in this region in any borders. And that drove the conflict for a long time. 1948, they launched a war to prevent Israel from being founded. 1967, they launched a war to destroy Israel. 1973, they tried again. And then Arab rejectionism started to fizzle away. Not very quickly at all. But I would say the first real rejection of Arab rejectionism was Egypt, right? Anwar Sadat being the courageous leader who stepped up and said, you know what, I'm going to recognize Israel and I'm going to end this. And that happened in 1979. And it took, it wasn't supported. It took another 15 years, right? Until 1994, when Jordan then stepped up and said, you know what, we're also going to recognize Israel and make peace with them. And so now what we're seeing is the rejection of Arab rejectionism has really come to the forefront. And now and really by 2002 with the Arab Peace Initiative, we saw the Arab world say, we're no longer rejectionists. We've accepted Israel's here to stay and they're not going anywhere. And so we have to move forward. But again, there are still the Palestinians. What hasn't diminished at all, I shouldn't say at all, but what hasn't diminished is Palestinian rejectionism and the rejectionism that we get from the more extreme Muslims in the region. And I'm adding in now this Islamic component, which is important because Iran is an Islamic country. It is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are driven by religion. Unlike, I would say, Fatah and other forces within the Palestinian society. But this rejectionism also stems from Iran, from Islamic beliefs in, well, this is Islamic territory and it was Islamic territory, and therefore you can't have anybody else ruling this territory but Muslims. And so what we have is kind of this battle that's going to take place of which side are the Palestinians going to choose, okay? Because they'll have this opportunity of this introduction of business and opportunity coming from the UAE and coming from Bahrain and coming from other places in the Middle East, where they could really choose the route of moderation, of opportunity, of a better future, right? But they have to understand that Israel is going to be alongside them when they do that, and that Israel is not going anywhere. Or they, unfortunately, if they choose to do so, they can continue to get closer and closer to these countries that are encouraging just the opposite, right? No, continue to live the life that you're living in refugee camps with a corrupt government, and just continue to be violent towards Israel and continue to reject every offer that's made to you by Israel, and eventually we'll win. So the last thing to talk about is what's going to happen with Palestinian and Israeli peace talks. You know, Trump, the Trump administration proposed his peace to prosperity plan in January of this year. And immediately the Palestinians came out saying, no, 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 no. If I remember exactly the quote from Mahmoud Abbas, I think that was the quote. No, 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 no. And so they immediately said, we're not doing that. But as this year has gone on and they've seen what's going on with the other Arab countries, they're getting very nervous. And so the hope is that they would then come back to the negotiating table. Now, the problem is when they come back to the negotiating table, they're basically saying, we don't want to start with the peace to prosperity plan, which starts from a basis of Israel having 30% of the West Bank and them having 70. But and again, that would be the start of negotiations, but they want to go back to the offer that was offered to them in 2008. Now, very quickly, and then we'll wrap up and we can take questions. In 2008, Ehud Olmert proposed an offer to Mahmoud Abbas. It included, with land swaps, 100% of the West Bank, with land swaps, okay? Meaning that some land Israel would take and then it would be exchanged with other territory. So it was 100%. It was Jerusalem as their capital. It was some refugees can return, but most of the refugees will be returned to the Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And we got a rejection from Mahmoud Abbas. In fact, he just never called Ehud Olmert back. And the offer just remained. It sat there, but nothing came of it. Now, the remarkable thought that many people have is, so 12 years later, you want Israel to just ignore everything that's happened in the last 12 years and go back to an offer that basically granted you 100% of the territory? What else are we supposed to offer you? How is that going to be a basis to jumping off to future negotiations when we offered you 100%? I don't know if you guys are all with me, but you can't offer more than 100%, right? Like that's the only way. So the idea of let's go back to 2008 is a little bit ridiculous. And then let's acknowledge another important part of this, which is that the Israeli government today is not the Israeli government of 2008. And in the last 5 years, the Israeli government has not exactly been a government that's like, yeah, sure, let's give up all of the West Bank and almost all of the West Bank. And so it's a little bit unrealistic, even if they were going to come back to the table. But now here's the sad part. The real sad part is we haven't heard that rhetoric. We've heard a little bit, maybe we'll come back to the table, but mostly it's, we're going to try to reunite with Hamas. That's been the Fatah rhetoric. We're going to try to have elections. And more and more, we're hearing them talk about violence. We're hearing them talk about, well, you know, we don't have anything else to resort to, so maybe we'll have another intifada. And that, I mean, could be, I mean, if I had to pick the worst option on the table for the Palestinians, it would be resorting to violence again. And it's remarkable if they do, because you're literally sitting there shaking them going, have you not learned? Violence only makes this worse. And it doesn't make it that much worse for Israelis, but it makes it much, much worse for Palestinians. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. But I would really say the Palestinians have an opportunity right now. They have a real opportunity to put aside everything that they've been taught and incited to believe and say, you know what, maybe there's a better opportunity. Now, I do also have to say one thing, and I'll end with this. Bibi Netanyahu also has a difficult challenge ahead, because what did he need to do to get these deals from the UAE and from Bahrain? He had to promise to to stop talking about any kind of annexation or applying sovereignty to the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Well, he did. He promised that. And then he went home, and when his right-wing base heard that that's what he promised, they lost it. What are you doing? And then he kind of walked back and he was like, no, it's just suspended, like we'll do it later. And then the Emiratis came out and said, no, you're not going to do it later. And so he has to toe a really fine line. And what also really aggravated his right-wing base was the knowledge coming out that they also agreed that the Americans were now going to be able to sell F-35 fighter jets to the UAE. And so he's in a really interesting position because he has to really move this forward. And moving it forward means, you know, giving some things to the Palestinians. And the Emiratis are saying to him, you need to directly appeal to the Palestinians and show them that this is good for them. And if you keep talking about annexation, then they're not going to believe you. And they're going to go the more extreme route. So what I want to say is, as much as the Palestinians have a choice, Israel can also very much affect that choice. And so our steps, the steps that we take moving forward, are going to be just as important. And so it's a very interesting time. I don't like predicting future. I think anyone who tries to predict the future of the Middle East is just going to fail, because it is the most unpredictable region in the world. You never know what's going to happen. But it's going to be very interesting, I would say, to watch it all play out in the next few months and in the next year. And I think the biggest thing that we should all be looking at as well is what the outcome of the American election is going to be. Because obviously the Trump administration has been very much pushing for this to happen. And so it's going to be interesting to see that if the Democrats take the White House and Biden takes office, if he's going to be as aggressive in trying to make sure that these things get put forward. If anything, what we could see is the Biden administration doing a good job at making sure that Israel sticks to its commitments, right? Because that's usually what a Biden government, if we can mirror that on maybe what the Obama administration did, seeing that Biden was the vice president, then they would be ones to really hold Israel accountable. And so that could be an interesting shift. Would the Trump administration do the same? Maybe, who knows? And so it's just a very interesting time. But I will end with this. Anyone who's out there trying to paint this as something negative, trying to say that this is bad in any way, shape, or form, is seriously misguided. And I would really start to question their intentions when it comes to how they're seeing Israel in this conflict. Because anyone who tries to paint normalization and peace agreements as something negative have a real problem. Yes, you can say what is going to be the impact on the Palestinians. And yes, maybe we need to be careful, sure. But in any way to say this is bad or this is wrong and that this shouldn't have happened, to me, I would say you're very misguided. And maybe, just maybe, you're one of those people who sits around saying that Israel shouldn't exist. And so, yes, if you don't believe Israel should exist, then yeah, you would be upset about these things. And so I would really start to question people who say something negative, because this is a positive. This is a positive for Israel. This is a positive for the Arab world. This could bring so many benefits to the Arab world. And so that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the positives, and I'm hoping that whatever negatives could come out of this, we will work out. But this is a good thing. And as an Israeli, I'm excited, and I can't wait to get on my next flight to Dubai and go to the Burj Khalifa. And I'll wrap up with this. Every one of you should Google the sukkah at the Burj Khalifa. Because for me, this was a moment. Last week on Thursday, Friday, I don't remember when it was, a photo was released of a sukkah, right? We're celebrating Sukkot right now for the Jews who are watching. And the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, immediately upon signing these agreements with Israel, they said that one of the restaurants in the Burj Khalifa was going to become kosher. It did. And then they built a sukkah outside of this restaurant. And there's an amazing photo of the very high Burj Khalifa and the sukkah at its base. And for me, that's something that should warm everyone's hearts. The welcoming of Jews, not just Israelis, but of Jews into the Arab world is something very special. And if I could end by talking about Stand With Us, one of the big things that we fight is anti-Semitism. And it's always been our mission because we fight anti-Zionism, which is a form of anti-Semitism. But today it's really fighting outright anti-Semitism that we're seeing in Europe, where Jews walk down the streets and get attacked. Germany, a 20-year-old boy in his 20s was, whacked over the head with a shovel just this past week. And we're seeing these attacks grow unfortunately, in size and in quantity. And also, as I can speak as an American, even here in the United States, we're seeing this become more and more widespread. And it just warms my heart to think that in a region where Jews have historically been persecuted and never really been fully welcomed, that things are shifting. And how weird to think that anti-Semitism is growing in one part of the world where we would expect it to decline. And maybe, just maybe, it's starting to diminish a little bit in a place in the world that we never really thought it would. So these are all positives. And with that, I will end, and I look forward to any questions that we have. Thank you all so much. Let's dive into the Q&A.
Great. So thank you very much, Charlotte, for your deep explanation of all the growing now recognitions of Israel. And here I've got several questions. So I'll start with the two questions that are Associate Editor Lucas Pizzichino from our newspaper Hatikva has prepared. So I'll give the word to him. Then I'll ask as well a question because I'm very curious about this topic. And then we'll go to the floor because I see we already have a couple of questions on our Facebook page. So Luca.
So good evening to everyone. So talking about the cooperation. So we see that the cultural cooperation stood up in the front pages of the newspaper for the first collaboration featuring between an Israeli singer and an Emirati one, which are the next cultural collaboration between Israel and the Emirates? So,
it's hard to, again, predict, but I'll jump back to what I spoke about a little bit, which is the two cultural things. Well, medicine is less cultural, but the one main cultural, two cultural things, I knew there were two cultural things that we talked about, which are, of course, the film and TV agreements that are being signed. That's culture at its finest. That's pop culture. And so, Israel has become a major outsourcer of this type of stuff. I'm sure many people watch Fauda, being one of the primary things that has come out of Israel on Netflix. And so that's going to be a big cultural shift, is I think the TV and film cooperation that's going to be taking place. And it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that. And then the other thing is, of course, the sports, and I think this has already slowly been happening. Sports, I think, is such a major cultural aspect of so many societies. And it didn't just start now with this, this soccer player being signed to the Dubai team. If we look back, we have these really sad incidences of, Israelis, an Israeli wrestler or judoku. Excuse me if my language is off. I'm not exactly well-versed in the world of sports, but he tries to, shake the hand of an Iranian after competing with him, or an Egyptian, after competing with him, and the Egyptian won't even shake his hand, right? Or Iranian athletes who are encouraged to either not compete when they have to compete against Israelis. I had a friend of mine who was an Olympian who was discriminated against at the Olympics because he had, the Israeli flag on his goggles, which had a Jewish star, who also went and competed in Turkey, and they wouldn't let him wear his Israel uniform. They wouldn't when he won, and he got either second or third place. and you stand on that podium and the pride of having your flag raised behind you. Well, he didn't have that. He had the flag of the International Triathlon Association raised behind him, not Israel. And so much has changed. Israel won in Abu Dhabi just this past year. And for the first time, Hatikva was played, the Israeli national anthem, the name of your newspaper, was played in an Arab country. And so I think the sporting aspect of all of this is going to be a big shift. And that's something to really look forward to. I think Elad wanted to add something.
Yes, thank you, Charlotte. I think to add on what you said, a lot of these things are happening in smaller scales, meaning not connected to the Israeli or the Emiratian government. For example, I've seen already a couple of people from my Facebook page having face-to-face Zoom calls with people in the Emirates. That was very, very cool to see. 10 Israelis, 10 people from there having Zoom calls. I'm personally studying dentistry, and we are having in, I think, 1 week, we're having a joint webinar with Israeli and Emiratian dentists. That's good. That's for the between the Israeli Dentist Association and the Emiratian Dentist Association. In February, there's going to be a huge international dentistry conference in Abu Dhabi, and now they've also invited Israelis. So this is going much further than only government. These things are super important, but there's so much things that we're not hearing. This is only me personally, and I'm sure that a lot of other people have the same stories. This is really, I believe, the start of a new Middle East.
Yeah, and if I could just jump on that, I would also just add just travel. I mean, travel being such a core aspect of Israeli society. I always joke, like, Israel feels really like trapped in because we can't like drive necessarily to our neighboring countries. And so people think there's so many Israelis in the world because we travel so much and we're very loud, let's be honest, and sometimes borderline obnoxious. But just that increase of travel to these countries, because Israelis are like, yeah, I'm going to Dubai, let's do it. I just said it, I want to. And that also is just that people-to-people interaction on all these different levels is going to be the game changer. And that's what we really talk about when we talk about a warm peace and these being peace agreements rather than just normalization agreements. And it's in all these areas. And like Elad said, I'm sure there are many more that we don't even know about that are happening day in, day out as the opportunities are opening up for this. Just something came to mind, I think it should be mentioned. There are also a lot of Palestinians who live in the United Arab Emirates. And so even that, the ability for Israelis and Palestinians to interact away from the conflict, away from the territory, where they can maybe have conversations that historically we were never really able to have, or at least since Oslo has been harder and harder to have, that also could open up a lot, not just for our relationship, our cultural connection, our relationship with the Emiratis and other Arabs, but also with Palestinians themselves.
I'm going to try going in February. If it works, I'll let you know how it's been.
Nice.
So I have also another question. And in the recent days, there were talks between Israel and Lebanon for maritime borders. And after a long pause, there were diplomatic relations between Israel and Lebanon. What can it lead to? And can it be a turning point for a withdrawal of Hezbollah in the Lebanese government and a prelude to a normalization agreement between the two countries?
It's such a good question. Lebanon is such a fascinating topic. And honestly, it's a lot to get into. So I'm just going to try to keep it on the surface. But really, I would recommend people to kind of dive into Lebanon a little bit more, kind of look at the background, because I think Hezbollah has given Lebanon such a bad name lately. But if you really look at Lebanon and the people in Lebanon, they tend to be a lot more progressive and not as violent and not extreme as Hezbollah is. So very quickly, Hezbollah is part of the government. Hezbollah, let's just be very clear, is a terrorist organization. They're a recognized terrorist organization. Actually, one of the other things that Honduras did was they recognized Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, as a lot of other countries are starting to do, even Middle Eastern countries. And Hezbollah is, of course, a force of Iran. And it's funny, I don't know how I got through all of this without talking about Iran. So I'm just very quickly going to mention that so much of what we're seeing play out in the region is a direct reaction to the growing Iranian aggression and attempt to gain more power in the Middle East, right? As all of these countries see Iran as a threat and want to really buddy up with Israel and have an alliance with Israel in their fight against Iran. And that also is why the UAE wants F-35s and wants more military capability, just in case we ever find ourselves in a direct conflict with Iran. Now, Hezbollah is backed by Iran. And Hezbollah is really an Iranian proxy in Lebanon. Now, yes, they have support amongst the Shiites in the country. They have 15 seats in the parliament, even though the government is kind of falling apart at the moment. But they really lost. They've been losing a lot of support. Already last year around this time, there started to be protests against Hezbollah because historically Hezbollah, they built up the country. They, were building schools and built hospitals. They really did a lot of social welfare, which kind of won people over. And then once they had power, they were like, we're done. So the quality of life for people in Lebanon really started to drop. And that then Hezbollah then as a result is experiencing a lot of backlash. Then add in the fact that, a month and a half ago, there was this huge explosion in Beirut that is being tied back to Hezbollah that killed not a small number of people. It was horrific and it was tragic. And it happened in a location in Beirut where the people were predominantly anti-Hezbollah already. And so it just deepened that frustration and animosity towards Hezbollah. There was another explosion just in the last week and a half, also not in Beirut, but in more South Lebanon. And then of course, Lebanon, Hezbollah tries to come out and after Bibi really called them out, right? Center stage at the UN, holds up one of his classic photos, says, this is a Hezbollah missile factory. He loves using his imagery, right? This is a Hezbollah factory. This is a gas station. This is a gas station. Here are homes. And Hezbollah, of course, tries to come out and say, no, he's lying. And then they take journalists into the factory. And as they're filming, Israel's watching this going, that's the machine that you use to make, these casings. And this is, so they basically just exposed themselves even more when they were trying to say, no, this isn't where we manufacture weapons. And so they're not in good shape. And the background of all of this is that, of course, there have been oil and natural gas fields found off the coast of Lebanon and Israel, right? This is the whole backdrop. And there's been an ongoing battle of who do these fields belong to? And so you have the Americans who have now stepped in. And what actually has happened just recently is, like you mentioned, Lebanon agreed to sit down in US mediated talks to figure out what the borders are going to be in the sea, the maritime borders. Now, just the simple fact that you're going to have Israelis and Lebanese sitting down and talking, even with the US in the middle, is a really big deal. And the hope that some people have is that that could be the next step to not just agreeing on the maritime borders, but agreeing on the land borders, which is something we have never been able to do. The line that rests between Israel and Lebanon is called the Blue Line. It was drawn with the UN as a mediator between Israel and Lebanon, but never as an official border. It was just a line that, you can't cross. And so there's a lot of opportunity. Now, you said something about, is this going to get rid of Hezbollah in Lebanon? Or will they withdraw? I would never use that term ever to talk about Hezbollah in Lebanon. There's no way that Hassan Nasrallah is just going to pack it up and say, okay, well, people don't like us, let's go. Unfortunately, getting rid of a terrorist organization within a territory is very, very challenging, especially when they're backed by a country like Iran. And Israel knows this quite well when we think of Hamas in Gaza or other terrorist organizations that control territory or at least have power in territory. So are they going to just pack up and leave? No. Could there potentially be an outright battle in the country? Maybe. But the key here is that in the past, they've had support from the Lebanese, and today that support is diminishing consistently. And you have other entities that are stepping in to possibly help figure out a way forward, pushing Hezbollah completely outside of the equation. And that entity is not just the United States, but the old school controller of Lebanon, which of course are the French. And the craziest part is that you have Lebanese. I have a Lebanese friend and many of his friends who are out there saying, we want the French back, bring back the French. Like, we would prefer now the French than like whatever, you know, we've tried. It's been kind of a disaster in the country for like 40 years, really ever since the Civil War. Nothing really ever stabilized, mainly again, because of Hezbollah and other factors, because regardless of who the government was, they were harboring Hezbollah. They were allowing Hezbollah to have this power in the southern part of the country and to plant their weapons all over the country. And so we're seeing such incredible shifts. And I really hope that they end up being positive. I hope that the Lebanese people won't suffer even more as a result of them trying to get rid of Hezbollah, but there's definitely an opportunity. And the Lebanese people would probably be more and more likely to support something that would look like normalization with Israel in the future if this continues to go the direction that it's going. What does this mean for Hezbollah? They're going to try to initiate conflict with Israel. And they're going to try, I should say they've already tried, because in the last few months, we've already had skirmishes with Hezbollah, because they also understand that if they drag Israel into a war, it's going to hurt the Lebanese people, because it always does. And so Israel's going to do its utmost to try to avoid that, which is why even with those small skirmishes that kind of sparked up on the border, things stayed calm, because Israel is seeing the potential in Lebanon. And the last thing we want to do is mess that up by going into another war that will really harm not Hezbollah that much, but really harm the people in Lebanon. So very interesting. I do want to give a plug to an organization called Alma. Alma, A-L-M-A. Alma is an amazing organization that was founded just recently. They're based in the northern part of Israel, and they're experts on what's going on with Lebanon and Syria and everything kind of that's taking place on the northern borders. So if you're more interested in this, I highly recommend following them, getting their newsletter, and watching some of the updates that they give, because they're really on the ball with this day in, day out, knowing what's going on with Lebanon. And it's a fascinating thing to watch. So great question. I love that. I'm sorry it was such a long answer, but I felt like I needed to give a lot of context there. So that's Lebanon.
Great. I think Luca is very satisfied by this answer, which was very nice and very deep and in all the aspects. Now, I've got instead another question about another area that is very close to us, is also quite close to Israel, and it's about Armenia and Azerbaijan. That lately we all saw that the conflict erupted again. It's a very long-lasting conflict. It's several decades that is going on. Basically, it's starting and stopping. And my question was basically Israel's position in this situation, because on one side, we are a very strong partner of Azerbaijan. Like lately, there was a $5 million agreement for military equipment. Azerbaijan sells petrol to Israel. Also, if I'm correct, we use Azerbaijan as a base for attacks on Iran, or for like they give us their airspace for military purposes, and also for Europe. Azerbaijan is a very strong partner in terms of gas, of natural gas for the Trans-Adriatic pipeline. But on the other side, we saw that just now for Rosh Hashanah, Armenia opened a new embassy in Israel, and also Armenia has has many important roots in Israel, with the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem, and I imagine there is also a big Armenian community in Israel. So is Israel Israel is really in the middle between these two positions? So what are we doing? Are we just watching? We don't do anything? Or could be Israel even a good character to be like a mediator between the two parts?
Yeah. So, I mean, everything you said, I don't have that much to add, because you basically put it all into the question. But yeah, you said it. We've had obviously very good and historic relationship with Azerbaijan, which is interesting too, seeing that they're one of the few Shiite majority countries in the world. And so that's just an interesting piece. But yeah, with what's going on now with Armenia, again, so you said it exactly. We are stuck in the middle. We have good relations with both. Armenia stepped in and said you shouldn't be selling weapons to Azerbaijan. And so Israel's going to find itself in a really interesting place. I don't really know I don't have that much more to add to it, because it's just going to be a matter of, does Israel choose to take a step back, which they might? Sometimes they tend to just avoid these things. We have enough issues within Israel that, do we really want to step in and try to act as a mediator for other conflicts when we're still emboldened in our own conflicts? Sorry about that. But the weird aspect of having a home phone. But so it's really going to be, I don't think Israel's going to jump in and do very much, but I think they're going to do their best to try to play the most middle ground possible so that they don't anger either country. Because that's kind of where Israel's going to stand. And maybe try to use back end channels to try to minimize the current tension going on. But again, it's a matter of predicting, and it's hard to know where Israel's going to position themselves on this one, because when it comes to Azerbaijan, this is a country that we can't mess with. We've had relations with them for so long, and we're not going to risk our relations with them. But it's the same thing with Armenians. We've had a historic relationship with them as well. That being said, there's also some tension between Israel and the Armenians, because even here we go again in not wanting to get involved or not wanting to anger countries, something that Israel never did. And I know I'm calling out Israel now, but Israel, because of their relationship with Turkey, which up until recently was actually a really good relationship, they never have recognized the Armenian genocide. Right. And so you have this reality where Israel does play politics in those things. Like, of course, outwardly, we would all say, of course, we recognize the genocide, but just to make sure that we don't anger, or anger more the Turkish government, we're going to hold off on that recognition. So I would see Israel trying to take as middle of the road as possible when it comes to this. And again, use not really doing anything publicly, but maybe using back end channels to try to calm things down. I don't know. We'll see. And I will stress, not my area of expertise. I'm sorry. There's certain things that I just have to admit. I was joking with all y'all before this started that you become an expert on Israel, and then as soon as Israel does anything with other countries, you have to become an expert on those countries as well. So that's unfortunately all I have to contribute to that one. But it's definitely something interesting to watch because it's happening such in real time. It's hard to know kind of where Israel's going to go. But I know they're going to do their best to try to not piss anyone off, if you will. That's kind of our MO. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for this insight. And also now we've got instead another question from Luca about more about what Stand With Us is doing, right, Luca?
Yeah. So have there been concrete results in the vision of the Jewish state in the public opinion since the foundation of Stand With Us? Have you ever had feedback from anyone regarding the change of the vision about Israel?
Okay, so I love this question. And also this is definitely my area of expertise. So yes, I think we have seen great successes in our years. I mean, we've been around now for 19 years. I think for a long time, I will say Stand With Us, a lot introduced this was an organization that was founded to really combat anti-Israel rhetoric and lies made against Israel or anti-Semitism. But as time went on, Stand With Us really shifted to also become a very proactive organization, an organization that's out there trying to talk about Israel, not from a reactive place, but just from a place of, this is Israel, this is what we love about it, this is the complexity of the country. And with those kind of efforts, I think we've seen real successes, and some of them are very hard to measure. It's hard to measure when somebody changes their mind, but we do have very classic stories of people who have become employees of Stand With Us, who went from being really anti-Israel to actually being pro-Israel simply after coming on a trip to Israel with Stand With Us, or having an interaction with a Stand With Us individual who came and spoke on their college campuses. We do a lot to try to reach out in the Arab world. We have a Stand With Us Arabic page, and we do get a lot of feedback on our Stand With Us Arabic page of people reaching out saying, we support Israel, we're with you, or people who also come out and say, I didn't really know this, and I've been raised to think, really bad things, and now I'm being introduced to new ideas that I've never really heard about before. And then again, just real concrete successes of things that I would say could have a potential long-term effect. Sorry to jump to the United States for a second, but I do think that this is important because it's the US and the way that they think also oftentimes has a ripple effect around the world. But we just had a success recently, just in the last week and a half, where in California, they were trying to pass an ethnic studies curriculum. So basically a curriculum where every high school student would be required to take a course on ethnic studies before graduating. And the Jews in this, first of all, last year, the first draft was very anti-Israel. It had BDS in there that we should be supportive of the BDS movement, and really telling the story of the Jews in just almost a false way. And then saying, well, we're not going to include the Jews because it's not an ethnicity, but it's a religion, which really minimizes what Jews are and the complexity of the Jewish people, but also minimizes our status as a minority. And so we have worked very hard to try to defeat this. Now, again, you might say she's just talking about California. Why does that matter? California in the United States is seen as one of the leaders when it comes to education. And so oftentimes what happens here ripples throughout the country, and other countries would then adopt that curriculum. And so Stand With Us is really on the ground, and oftentimes we're doing things behind the scenes to try to make sure that these kind of things don't happen, so that, again, you don't have now students taking these courses where basically an entire generation would move forward with really false realities and false understandings of what Jews are, how does Israel fit into the equation, what's Zionism. And just over the years, I think the biggest thing that we can point to is the defeat and divestment resolutions that are proposed on college campuses, where more and more we're trying to see laws almost, and in schools, legislation, resolutions passed to try to really affect the US-Israel relationship and Israel's status on that campus. And we have been instrumental in defeating these kind of resolutions. So, it's very hard to gauge your success when it comes to public opinion. We're a grassroots organization, so it's really about how many individuals have you affected over the years, which is a very hard thing to gauge. But in terms of those bigger successes of defeating resolutions that are anti-Israel, making sure that anti-Israel sentiment or rhetoric does not become mainstream, I think we have many things that have been quantifiable that show great successes. And I think, I'm just going to put this personally out there, because I'm usually not very instrumental. I don't work. That's not what I do within the organization. I'm an educator. And, a lot of times people ask me, like, who are you mostly educating? And the majority, I think, of people that I educate are Jews. They're people who are already Zionists, who are pro-Israel. And a lot of people oftentimes say to me, well, you're just preaching to the choir. Now, I'm not preaching to the choir, because I'm not trying to convince these people to be pro-Israel. They already are. But what I think I've realized, and I think Elad can correct me if he disagrees, but I think that today, my biggest issue is that there are so many Jews out there who experience anti-Semitism or hear these things, and they're either not brave enough or aren't confident enough to be able to stand up and speak out. And I think what Stand With Us does more than anything else is it gives young Jews and young Zionists around the world the strength and the confidence and the knowledge that they need to stand up and speak out when they encounter these things. And that, to me, is the biggest success of Stand With Us, because we might not know of every incident, but more and more, if we don't sit quietly, but if we speak out when it's happening, we're going to start to see real change. And that's what I think Stand With Us does better than anything else, is instilling in young Jews and young Zionists that confidence. And again, not be afraid. Don't run away from this, because when we run away from it, if we can't stand up in the face of this, who's going to, right? And so that's where I think Stand With Us really, really is making changes within the Jewish world. And then ultimately that ripples out into the larger world. So.
Thank you for the answer, the exhaustive answer. And I think we have some questions from the viewers that we read.
Viewers. So Luca Clementi, so another editor in our newspaper Hatikva, is asking, so is there a left way to do Trump's work for Israel, or is it just something that is connected to Trump's way to act? Like, he asks it because a lot of Democrats are afraid to vote for Biden because Trump helped so much Israel to reach these diplomatic goals. So what do you think about this approach?
I don't know if it's a Democrat-Republican situation. I think it really depends on the character of the person. I think we need to really grasp that the current climate in the Middle East, you can't really pin it on one person, right? Like I can't say because of Trump's efforts, this happened. I think there was, if we look at what has happened in the last 20 years in the Middle East, many of the circumstances have led to this. And actually, I mean, you can even go back as far as, you know, George Bush, a Republican, right, has an aggressive approach in the Middle East, topples Saddam Hussein, which triggers a lot of instability, allows Iran to kind of see a prospect for gaining more power. They try to ease that, and they try to kind of hold the ground so that it doesn't become just a chaotic environment. Obama steps in as a Democrat and is a real idealist when it comes to foreign policy. And he believes that, you know, we need to befriend Iran and we need to bolster Iran, and that's going to make them less aggressive. And so he goes ahead with that mentality and he brings them to the table and he signs the JCPOA, right? The nuclear agreement with Iran. And the funniest thing is that the complete unintended consequences, and I'm not giving Obama credit for doing this because they were completely unintended consequences, but his approach of trying to kind of bolster Iran led to the Sunni Arab countries really turning and being like, okay, well, Iran is now has more legitimacy, is trying to gain more power, and we're afraid of Iranian aggression and of potential, you know, what the future is going to be. And so that's what really pushed them into the hands of Israel. And so that kind of was all triggered back during the Obama administration. The key was that the Trump administration embraced the circumstances and pushed for things like this to happen because the circumstances were ripe, right? And so here's when we look at a potential Biden administration, you know, because Iran has exposed itself as being way more aggressive and really didn't come into the JCPOA with genuine and legitimate, you know, the word is escaping me, but a genuine willingness to actually want to create a more peaceful world. I don't think the Biden administration would jump back to it and try to reinstate it and try to somehow get back to the Obama mentality of, you know, Iran could be good if we just work with them. I think Iran has really shown themselves to not be, but I could be wrong. To be honest, though, if you pull back from all of this, the real reason that American Democrats are more and more afraid of voting for somebody like Biden has to do with the current politics inside of the United States, specifically with the progressive left. The progressive left has become, unfortunately, they've been really hijacked by the anti-Israel movement. And as a result, it's a lot, you hear rhetoric coming out of very extreme leftists in America that is anti-Semitic and very anti-Zionist, but they're an extreme. And then on the other side, and now you even more so now, Jews are kind of, wait a second, they're having a moment because in the last debate, when Trump was asked to condemn white supremacists in the country, which if you want to talk about the far left as being anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, you can't then ignore the far white supremacists who are also extremely anti-Semitic. And having a president who refused to, on that stage, condemn them and to say something like, you know, stand back, stand by. It was a moment also where I also heard some of my Jewish friends and I heard the rhetoric within the Jewish community of, wait a second. I mean, I get that we're afraid of the far progressive left, but here's a president who didn't condemn white supremacy. And so there's a lot of interesting American political dynamics that are going on in terms of why American Jews are really questioning who they're going to vote for. Because yeah, no one can deny that policy coming out of the Trump administration has been pro-Israel and pro-Jewish. I mean, one of the executive orders that he signed made it, you know, really made it easier to prosecute or to at least bring people up on charges when they do something anti-Semitic, strengthening things like Title IX that we have in this country that should protect Jews from anti-Semitism. So policy-wise, you could say he's done great, but there are issues. And it was the same thing with the Obama administration and potentially the future Biden administration. So there's just a lot of internal things going on that Americans are asking themselves in this upcoming election. But I will say it's split very simply. If you're right-wing in Israel and in Israeli politics, and if you're an Orthodox Jew who supports Bibi Netanyahu and supports the right-wing government, you're most likely voting for Trump. And if you are more left-leaning and you don't support Bibi Netanyahu and the current Israeli government, and you're a two-state solutioner and things like that, and you're for a withdrawal and things like that, then you're going to be a Biden supporter. And it's those who kind of sit in the middle who are struggling with who they're going to vote for. It's, again, very, very hard, I think, to predict what a Biden administration will do with the current conditions of the Middle East. It's very hard to know. And to be honest, they're not talking about it very much, because right now in America, it's American politics that are taking center stage. And we've yet to talk very much about foreign policy in the debates. The platform, though, of Biden continues to be pro-Israel. The platform of the Democrats, they refuse to include the word occupation. They pulled out all the BDS stuff. And so it continues to be a pro-Israel platform, because, I mean, we should stress that in America, Israel's been a bipartisan issue, and it should remain a bipartisan issue. But internal politics are kind of affecting that in a really negative way. So I hope that was a sufficient answer. It's a big animal to tackle, the American politics and how anti-Semitism in Israel fits in right now. But that's, I think, the best that I can do for that one. So it'll be definitely be an interesting election, and it'll definitely be interesting to see the first year of the next administration, be it a Trump administration or a Biden administration. I mean, obviously we know Trump would continue on this path. Biden, we'll see.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. Actually, I know that we could begin a new webinar only about American politics and the relationship with Israel, but since we had you here, we wanted to exploit every minute that we could have to ask the many questions. So now we've got another question from Patricio, who's the Stand With Us manager for Latin America, who has a very nice question that I read before, and he wrote it on Facebook. So actually he's with us on Zoom, so if you want to say it yourself, you're welcome.
Thank you, David. So Charlotte, the question that I have for our friends in Europe, in the Netherlands, Italy, and other places is, given that the European Union has a very biased opinion and actions against Israel, how could countries like the Netherlands or Italy improve their relations with Israel?
Listen, I think the EU is ultimately a collection of these countries, right? Like the EU, like we shouldn't treat it as like an independent body, right? It's representatives from all these countries, right? And so as countries decide to change their way in which they interact with Israel, the EU is going to be forced to follow. That's kind of my perspective. It just they have to have the courage to do it and to stand up to EU threats. And I say threats because I didn't mention this when it came to, Serbia and Kosovo, but they got a lot of pushback from the EU when they mentioned that they were thinking about moving their embassies to Jerusalem. The EU came out very much against them, saying, this is going to go against our policy. You can't do this. But again, if enough countries stand up and say, well, we need to change the policy because we disagree, then maybe, just maybe, the relationships can change. I mean, if you look at a country like the UK, I know the UK, Brexit, they separated from the EU, but for a long time they were part of the EU, and their relationship with Israel was always a warm one, was always positive. Yes, of course, they held Israel accountable, and they sometimes would call out Israel when Israel did something that they disagreed with. But overall, it was much more favorable than the overarching EU approach to Israel. And so what we have is a history of countries being part of the EU who decide on their own what their relationship with Israel is going to be. And so if more countries, start to take the steps towards Israel more and more, then the EU might have to follow. Right. And that's just having the courage to be able to do that. I mean, if I can go back to what we talked about in the beginning, Anwar Sadat, Egypt was part of the Arab League. And he basically decided on his own to go ahead and recognize Israel in 1979 when it was like completely went against Arab League policy. And yeah, they took a hit for it. They were condemned and there were boycotts, but eventually they got over it. And as time went on, the Arab League eventually followed. And so sometimes it also takes these countries to lead the way and not just default to the EU and allow the EU to decide where things are going. And to be honest with you, I think it's a little bit problematic that the EU has really been very biased when it comes to Israel. They're not exactly being a diplomatic body the way that a diplomatic body is supposed to act. And I mean, again, neither has the UN and neither has others, but they've gone very far. And so I think it's really the responsibility of these countries that if they want to better relations, they just have to take the steps to do it. Israel's there, ready and willing. And maybe the EU will follow and maybe it won't, but they need to stand up to the EU and say, we're not gonna cave to these threats. We're a part of the European Union. And so we have a say in what the policies are going to be moving forward. I think it really comes down to having a backbone. And again, listen, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to say this, but when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to things like that, you know, as we see, it takes courage to stand up. It's so easy to be a bystander. It really is. It's the easiest thing to do. And by being a bystander, you're ultimately only helping the perpetrators. And so for the EU to continue to do what they do, all it shows is a lack of courage to speak up and speak out against things like anti-Semitism and against things like terrorism against Israel and the violence that Israel experienced by taking a full of basically the side of the Palestinians and putting the entire onus on Israel to make peace, not even giving any kind of recognition that the Palestinians are also part of this. And they have absolutely taken steps that have harmed the peace process. And so by doing so, they're allowing these things to continue. They're allowing the incitement in Palestinian textbooks that continue to teach Palestinian children to blow themselves up and to go and fight Israel and to risk their lives to do so. And so it takes courage and it takes the efforts of these leaders to step up and say, no, we're not going to toe the line. We are going to do what we think is best for us as a country and ultimately for the EU and ultimately for everyone in the region. And so it's a matter of courage and being able to speak out for what's right. And by the way, speaking out for what's right doesn't mean that you're taking just a pro-Israel stance. There is a way to be in the middle here. And I think more people need to embrace how they can be in the middle rather than choosing sides, which ultimately ends up just deepening the conflict, not helping it in any way. So if they want to do it, they should do it, and they should have the courage to do so. And hopefully the EU will have to follow. That's my perspective on it.
Okay, so thank you again for this answer. We also, for me, Luca and Elad, who are now currently in Europe, it's very important to understand what the future of the European Union will be in this sector, in this approach. And now I think we arrived sort of to the end because I don't see any more questions. We also are running a bit late, but I hope that for you it's not a problem. But now
I have a meeting in 4 minutes, so okay. We're wrapping up at the right time.
So let's wrap it up real quick. I think we've got some final remarks from Elad, who so nicely helped us to create this webinar that I hope the people at home enjoyed. So Elad, would you be kind to tell us some final words, and then we can wrap it up here, I think.
Thank you so much, David, and of course, Charlotte, for your expertise and your time. So I just wanted to say thanks for everybody who watched a couple of minutes in and out. We had a huge reach. This was a huge success. And I hope the cooperation between Holland and Italy will only be stronger and stronger. And that StandWithUs will grow in Europe. And as Charlotte said, we're not going to be bystanders. We're going to be active. And that's the goal of StandWithUs, and we're doing it already in Holland. We're going to do it in Italy, and from there we can only grow. So again, if you want to be involved with either StandWithUs Holland or StandWithUs Italy, either go to our Facebook, StandWithUs Nederland, or StandWithUs Italy, on the website StandWithUs.com, via UG or Hatikva, and we hope to see you soon. And David, I hope to have many more of these amazing events.
We too. We really enjoyed this great meeting. It's also very nice to do something more international with Jay, to do something in English with people from all across the world. And yeah, we really enjoyed it. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much, Charlotte, especially for dedicating to us this time. And yeah, we invite you, everybody from home, to follow us and then to join in the future meetings that we will propose to you. So thank you very much, everyone, and good evening. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone. It was such a pleasure, and thank you all for having me. Good evening.